Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to introduce today's speaker, someone I have had the privilege of knowing since my undergraduate days at AUB. He probably doesn't remember that, actually. I first met Hani Hassan when he gave a memorable interpretation of Waiting for Godot. Here in West Hall, it was outside West Hall, a performance that already revealed the thoughtfulness and depth that have come to define his work. My second encounter with him, which he also doesn't remember because I never mentioned it, it was in the Jaffet Library. And I was struggling with a text by St. Augustine for what was called CVSP, or CS was at the time. And he heard me and he stopped. We've never talked before. And he sat with me for half an hour and explained that passage for me. We've never interacted before that. And you don't remember this. I was an undergrad in my first year, but this says a lot about the type of person we're talking about and the type of person I'm introducing today. Hani holds a PhD in philosophy from the Lebanese University and teaches in the Department of Philosophy and the Critical Humanities for the Liberal Arts program at AUB. His scholarship is characterized by meticulous rigor, intellectual honesty, and a profound engagement with some of the most challenging questions at the intersection of Arabo-Islamic philosophy, existentialism, and the philosophy of language. His dissertation was about Al-Kindi, who is generally thought as the first Arab philosopher. Don't know how truthful is that. We'll hear more about this actually today. But academic contributions, Hani has shown a strong commitment to community engagement, particularly through his leadership of the MAPI Tomorrow's Leaders Program at AUB, where he has helped mentor a generation of students dedicated to critical inquiry and public service. And we've interacted in the last few years about very difficult cases, and he really invests a lot of time in this. It's also important to recognize the partnership that has shaped and supported his work. His wife, Rita Basil, has been a key force behind the Center for Arts and Humanities at AUB. It's an opportunity for me to acknowledge Rita. I didn't mean to connect you, but because it's towards the end of the semester, and Rita has organized more than 30 events in one semester. You've heard it. It wasn't planned like this. These were our activities for the whole year, but of course, because of the war, everything pushed to the spring. So she has organized all these events in one semester in very difficult conditions. So thank you also, Rita. And together they represent, thank you. And together they represent a vision of academic life rooted in ethical commitment, intellectual rigor, and service to the broader community. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hani Hassan to AUB. And the talk today is titled A Different Rose by a Different Name, Philosophy in the Islamicate World. Tafadhal, Hani.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bilal, for your really humbling introduction. Very kind words. Thank you for giving me the opportunity of being here today. Thank you, Dr. Orfali. Thank you, Rita, and the Center for Arts and Humanities. And thank you for being here. So as a prelude, allow me to begin with a preliminary note. The debate and discussion on the naming of Islamic philosophy, which is more or less the focus of our presentation here today, has been ongoing for a while. Sorry, I'm gonna get my timer going because I tend to go for too long, so sorry. Now, in the context of today's presentation, however, and within its limitations, I will be focusing on a few authors and references spread between the 20th century and the early 21st century, noting that my choice of these authors is of ones that I take to be representative of certain approaches and are not chosen solely or singularly for their own stance, right? So that's in terms of a kind of a prelude of sorts. So to launch off today's presentation as a sampling of the issue at hand, I offer this background illustration that I came across in the preface and introduction to Peter Groff's Islamic Philosophy A to Z, published by the Edinburgh University Press in 2007. In the context of clarifying what he means to speak of when writing on Islamic philosophy, Peter Groff notes that, quote in the introduction, Islamic philosophy has no uniquely Islamic essence. Emphasis mine. It might simply be described as philosophy that emerges within the context predominantly informed by the religious, social, political, and cultural dimensions of Islam. As such, its presuppositions and conclusions may or may not be Muslim, end quote. In the preface to the same work, written by Oliver Leaman, who is the editor of the series, Leaman writes the following. Islamic philosophy is like all philosophy when tied in with religion, in having indistinct parameters and requiring an understanding of the religion as well as of the philosophy. Peter Groff explains a good deal about Islam in this book, and in particular the range of theoretical issues that arose in the religion. Many of these are more theological than philosophical, or so one might think, but really the distinction is rather artificial in Islamic philosophy. And this is barely 2 pages apart on the same work. One is basically saying, Peter Groff is basically saying, there's nothing Islamic in essence here. The editor of the series is saying, you can't really distinguish, or the distinction between Islamic theology and Islamic philosophy is artificial. So this is, in a way, a snapshot of some of the ambivalence and some of the scholarly tension that I will be sharing with you today. So during my research for my PhD, which yes focused a lot on Al-Kindi, but also on the kind of the development of what we generally call Islamic philosophy, and particularly what it means to speak of Islamic philosophy as a standalone branch or school of philosophy in its own right. This is something I always go to with Ian Richard Netton, right? To speak of Islamic philosophy in its own right. I came across what I initially considered to be an interesting but perhaps tangential debate, and that's the question of naming. For there seemed to be some debate on whether this branch of philosophical development, which we're most commonly referring to as Islamic philosophy, and usually placed to begin in the 9th century, 2nd century Hijri, and usually closed with a bracket of Ibn Rushd, though more recent scholarly work does not close a bracket, fortunately. And of course, it's associated with names like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Ibn Bajjah, etc. So whether this branch of philosophy is best referred to as Islamic philosophy, Arabic philosophy, Muslim philosophy, or some other name. As I said, I thought this to be an interesting debate, but not necessarily of great consequence to my main purpose of research, and perhaps best addressed by invoking Shakespeare's words, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." For truly, what would it matter if we named it Islamic or Arabic or Muslim? What matters is that we address ourselves to that rose and seek out its essence and its distinctive matter and form. However, the further I read into the issue, the more I realized that this is not merely a marginal disagreement on the preferred signifier for the intended signified, but rather went further, and quite consequentially, into the very subject matter of what this philosophy is, its quiddity, its development, and its significance. In electing the one label over the other, the concerned scholar was not merely expressing a preference for the label, but rather were grounding this in the very matter and form of the philosophy itself, and on premises offered to argue either for the clear Hellenic heritage of said philosophy and its distance from the theological framework of Islam as religion, or, to the contrary, to argue for the clear Islamic rootedness of said philosophy and its development within the climate of Islamic religious worldview. As I examined further, not only on the matter of the name, but equally on the essence and the nature of this branch of philosophy under investigation, I arrived at two conclusions that I aim to share with you today. The first is that, with regards to the debate on the name, and whereas it may appear that it is centered on the most appropriate label for the same signified, the issue is actually more complex and, yes, more interesting than that. And there may, in fact, be more than one rose being discussed. The second conclusion is that the particular rose, sorry, too many roses, but I'll move beyond them in a minute. The particular rose associated with the time frame, 9th century, 12th century, 13th, 14th, depends how far you want to go back to Mullah Sadra and onwards. And then usual personages, Al-Kindi usually being thought of as the first and onwards. So that particular field of philosophical development is indeed a further development of Hellenic heritage and not born out of the Islamic religious worldview. But don't take my word for it. I'm going to reference the authors themselves. So let's first begin by going over the debate on the name and label of said philosophy. So in the span of over a century since the appearance of T.J. de Boer's book, History of Philosophy in Islam, appeared 1901, English translation 1903. And I'm using this as my first bracket because in the 20th century has taken to be like the first full work dedicated to the topic. Down to our day, obviously there's been a lot of scholarly work on Islamic philosophy. What is it? Key authors, what are its defining moments, its defining movements, etc., as well as, of course, the question of to what extent is it in fact Islamic and grown out of the very spirit of Islam. In all such works, the common moment of tension is the answer to the question whether there is a specific branch or species of philosophy to be referenced and studied in its own right as Islamic philosophy. The proposals and answers to this matter, as they appear in the works, directly or indirectly, seem to run a spectrum on a continuum with two extremes representing the rarer kind of discussions. Most of the discussion goes on in between. But the two extremes are, on the one hand, is a kind of approach that totally dismisses or denies the development of Islamic philosophy as such and addresses it more as a Greek philosophy in Arabic. The other extreme is to deny the Hellenic heritage totally and to discuss it purely as an Islamic development, right? But like I said, most of the scholarly work, fortunately, doesn't fall on the extreme. It falls somewhere in the middle. Sorry, I lost my place. So in between these two extremes, as I said, is where we read most of the scholarly output. One that accepts that non-Arabic and non-Islamic sources did enter into the development of Islamic philosophy, and at the same time maintains the development of some new form of philosophy at the hands of the Islamic philosophers, with some focusing more on the Islamic element of this new form and others on the Greek and Hellenic element. Yet, though these scholars all seem to be addressing themselves to the same question and topic of Islamic philosophy, it would appear that there are two distinct philosophical systems or trajectories being addressed. The first is Islamic philosophy with the emphasis on the word Islamic. And the second, you guessed it, is the emphasis on the word philosophy. And the two are not synonymous and not congruent, I think. Now, one of the earliest detailed discussions on the question of the naming from our region, thank you, Professor. I reminded Professor Sayyid earlier that he first suggested that I look into Mustafa Abdul Raziq. Is Mustafa Abdul Raziq Tamheed, there's no English unfortunate translation, so I'll just reference the Tamheed li Tarikh al-Falsafa al-Islamiyya, prolegomena or preface to the history of Islamic philosophy, which was published in 1944. In a section of the work entitled The Dispute on Naming, so already that was clear that there's a dispute. Is this Islamic or Arabic? He presents a summary of the discussion from both sides of the camp, concluding with a seemingly viable argument justifying his choice of the term Islamic philosophy. The crux of the argument is that in speaking of this philosophy, it would be wrong to use a name other than that given to it by its own people, from which he then proceeds to show that figures like Ibn Sina, Al-Shahrastani, and Ibn Khaldun all speak of Islamic philosophers, and as such, one ought to reference them as their own contemporaries and historians did. This entails that since one speaks of Islamic philosophers, then one would also speak of Islamic philosophy. However, it must be noted that the references he gives do not actually speak of Islamic philosophy or Islamic philosophers as such, but rather Islamic practitioners of philosophers, al-mutafalsifah, in Ibn Sina's Shifa al-Najat, or otherwise some of these references speak of the sages of Islam, hukama al-Islam, like Zahir al-Din al-Bayhaqi in his Tarikh Hukama al-Islam, and with Shams al-Din al-Shahrazuri in his Nuzhat al-Arwah wa Rawdat al-Afrah. For those who do not in fact, as for those who do in fact speak of the philosophers of Islam, as he says, falāsifah al-Islam, such as Shahrastani and Ibn Khaldun, is that really the same as speaking of Islamic philosophers and therefore of Islamic philosophy? I'm just raising it as a question mark. I'm not going to dwell on it. But it seems to be, maybe the philosophers of Islam could mean something else here. So we're not going to come to any conclusion here. We're going to put that matter aside and move on to another key figure in this kind of trajectory, who is Henri Corbin, of course. In his History of Islamic Philosophy, Henri Corbin presents perhaps one of the clearest defenses for the choice of the term Islamic philosophy. Having explicitly rejected the reference of Arab philosophy, whether it refers to, quote, an ethnic designation, that's his word, denoting the philosophers and their culture, or to, quote, philosophy written in the Arabic language, that is the written Arabic, end quote, he opts for the label of Islamic philosophy, a designation which he argues is both broad enough to preserve the spiritual ecumenism of Islam, of the concept of Islam, and at the same time maintains the concept Arabic at the level of prophetic revelation, at which made its appearance in history with the Quranic revelation, end quote. Presenting the rationale from a different perspective, Sayyid Hussein Nasr, in his book Islamic Philosophy from its Origins to the Present, makes explicit and clear use and emphasis, again, on the term Islamic philosophy, and equally clear and explicit critique of the use, Arabic philosophy. Writing in one of the endnotes to chapter 1 that the usage of the term originating in medieval times was later adopted by Arab scholars of history of philosophy because of non-scholarly reasons associated with the ideology of Arab nationalism. It has taken, he goes on, he says, it has taken a great deal of effort during the past few decades by both Muslim and some Western scholars to make the use Islamic philosophy the correct manner of referring to the prevalent subject, while for the most part, because of political reasons, the term Arabic philosophy still survives in certain circles. Now, from a somewhat different perspective, Alessandro Cancian takes another strong stance against the use of Arabic philosophy for the employment of the term Islamic philosophy, though still in line with both Corbin and Nasr. In the section dedicated to Islamic philosophy, in the Handbook of Medieval Studies, Terms, Methods, and Trends, Cancian writes, classical Western handbooks on Islamic philosophy had long referred to the matter in terms of Arabic philosophy. Heir to medieval scholastic tradition, this wording must be definitely rejected, and no serious Islamicist, take note, no serious Islamicist, nor informed historian of philosophy uses this term any longer. Okay. Now, besides Corbin and Nasr, and both before and after them, many others, of course, employ the term, though perhaps without such explicit clarification as to the choice. Charles Butterworth utilizes the term Islamic philosophy very consistently. Franz Rosenthal, Joseph Van Es, both generally opted for and used the terms Islamic philosophy and Islamic philosophers. Though in this regard, Rosenthal, by the way, is a bit hesitant. In many cases, he writes Islamic philosophy with inverted commas. And at one point, he uses the term Muslim philosophy. This latter approach towards labeling it as Muslim philosophy is best encountered in the two-volume work entitled History of Muslim Philosophy, edited by Mian Muhammad Sharif, published in the 60s. In the introduction to that work, Sharif writes explicitly that the aim of the work is to give an account of Muslim philosophy which had its beginnings in a religion based on philosophical fundamentals. This, by the way, is very much what Mustafa Abdul Razik also argues in his Tamheed. Adding that book 2, coming after book 1, which covers philosophy in the pre-Islamic era, book 2 is dedicated to the philosophical teachings of the Quran, with the express hope that the two books together will give the reader a correct idea of the real source of Muslim philosophy and enable him to view this philosophy in its true perspective. Now, some scholars in the field of study do not seem to see an issue to resolve and take an approach that treats the terms Islamic and Arabic interchangeably. Such is the case with Richard Walzer, for instance, who writes quite comfortably about Islamic philosophers, Arabic philosophers, Islamic philosophy, Arabic philosophy. No issue there. Another such example is Majid Fakhri, who seems to be comfortable with both. In the introduction to a history of Islamic philosophy, Fakhri writes, Islamic philosophy is the product of a complex intellectual process in which Syrians, Arabs, Persians, Turks, and Berbers, and others took an active part. The Arab element is so predominant, however, that it might be conveniently termed Arabic philosophy. But he doesn't. He prefers the usage of the term Islamic philosophy for the following reason. He says, we observe here that the intellectual history of the Arabs, to whom the development of philosophy and science in the Near East owed so much, virtually begins with the rise of Islam. So conveniently, let's call it Islamic philosophy. However, when Fakhri he put together a summative edition of this work in Arabic. It seems from the introduction to that work, he was asked to do so, and which he published in 1981 in Beirut. The work was published under the title A Brief History of Arabic Philosophy. No contradiction, because in the preface, he does say explicitly that with regards to the debate on naming, he views it as one of little significance, as it does not touch or impact the essence of the subject matter. In other words, and to revive our earlier rose, from Majid Fakhri's perspective, this is a clear case of a rose by any other name. Right. Now, not many authors or scholars echo that sentiment. And as much as scholars referenced earlier insist on the term Islamic philosophy to highlight the rootedness and connectedness of said philosophy to Islam as a religion and worldview, there are those who would prefer to a total distancing of said philosophy from religious Islamic connotation and voice a clear preference for the use of the term or the label Arabic philosophy. In the preface to Classical Arabic Philosophy, an anthology of sources, the authors write, whatever the deeper issue may be for preferring one label to another, we do not intend to adjudicate it here, but merely to explain it. Our use of Arabic philosophy is for no other reason than that during the time period covered by this anthology, and again note the time brackets, this is the beginning of the 9th century to the end of the 12th century, right? Al-Kindi ibn Rushd, more or less. The Arabic language was the primary vehicle through which philosophy was being practiced in the Near East, and it is the sole language in which all the works translated here were originally written. So a very neutral argument from language, and rooted in the translation movement, which, as you'll see, many do. In a similar vein, though, with an added explicit tone of criticism towards those who use the reference Islamic philosophy, Dimitri Gutas, quite unwaveringly, champions the reference Arabic philosophy. In his article, The Study of Arabic Philosophy in the 20th Century, Gutas puts forth a clear and perhaps swaying remark for his choice, outlining two main reasons. The first, and much like McGuinness just noted, is that Arabic was the language of the Islamic civilization and the vehicle in which the identity and self-consciousness of that culture was cultivated and transmitted to all citizens in the Islamic world, regardless of religion. And the second, he notes, is that through efforts of the translators of Greek philosophical works, Arabic was made into a philosophical language. So again, it seems to be an argument from language also rooted in translation. But Gutas goes further, right? Gutas then attacks the choice of the label Islamic philosophy, and particularly he has in mind Henri Corbin, by the way, arguing that calling Arabic philosophy Islamic and consequently seeing it as essentially linked to the religious and spiritual fact of Islam, injects an overpowering religious dimension to it which was not there, adding that such a naming is either rooted in a premise of equivalence or a resultant confusion between Islamic theology and Arabic philosophy. Remember at the very beginning we saw Oliver Leaman, who says the distinction is artificial between Islamic philosophy and Islamic theology. And that equivalence, argues Gutas, and confusion, both of which lead to misreadings of the content of said philosophy, as well as being detrimental to its study. In like manner, Peter Adamson writes of Arabic philosophy and Islamic philosophy, and Arabic philosophers, and he offers a clear argument in the introduction to one of the works of which he is editor. It was Peter Adamson and Richard Taylor. And the editors in the introduction write, "We hope to draw attention to the decisive impact of the translation movement." So again, that's now the main reference. By calling this a companion to Arabic and not Islamic philosophy. It is Arabic because it is a philosophy that begins with rendering of Greek thought in all its complexity into the Arabic language. But moving beyond the mere question of translation, they also add two further reasons. The first being that many of those who involved were Christian and Jews. It wasn't just Muslims, right? But the more central reason that they add is that certain philosophers of the formative period, like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and Ibn Rushd, and Ibn Rushd, were interested primarily in coming to grips with the texts made available in the translation movement rather than with putting forward a properly Islamic philosophy. Right? So that's the main direction of that argument. Whenever I read just a quick anecdote on the side. I offer the course Islamic Philosophy regularly at AUB, and I often get emails from students and saying, please, if there is no capacity or whatnot, or they're asking about the course, I really want to understand my religion better. And that's usually my I go back and I say, no, this is Islam, it's not philosophy of Islam. It's, you sense this a lot going through these various scholars. All right, sorry. So there's one additional approach to the naming, which I'll close with, I encountered could perhaps sidestep the debate by bringing together the various sides despite their differences. And that is to opt for the label Arab Islamic or Arabo-Islamic philosophy. In my research, I only found one scholar who actually utilizes this. In his book, I'm going to use the French title, excuse my French, in the literal sense, I'm going to read French. Introduction that wasn't French. Introduction à la critique de la raison arabe. Right? And this is, of course, Al-Jabiri, Muhammad Abdul Jabiri, which is translated in English as Arab Islamic Philosophy, a Contemporary Critique. In that work, he actually uses the term Arab Islamic, though he doesn't offer any reasoning or explanation or clarification for why it's being used rather than Arabic or Islamic. But he is talking about Arab Islamic culture. So I did actually myself employ that term for a while in my research, but then I've recently dropped it because I am more inclined to see that it doesn't actually tackle the issue. It kind of sidesteps it and maybe creates even more issues. So in light of the overview of the debate I put before you, I think you can see that the issue here is more than just a question of what name do we prefer. And the scholars of the field from across the different sides of the aisle may not all be speaking about the same thing, right? Nor indeed may they all be speaking about roses. I need to bring up the rose again. That is to say, the debate is not merely of what to call this, but rather it seems that they're debating what to call different things. And I hope I'll share a bit more with you in the next few minutes. So, for the numerous authors who approach and study the subject of Islamic philosophy with the emphasis on the term philosophy, and whether it be with a view to denying its originality, particularly if you look at the late 19th century, well into the mid-20th century actually, or to affirming aspects of it, The focal point in the discussion is on the development and propagation of philosophical worldviews and systems received in the Islamicate world and built upon clearly Hellenic foundations. Right? The works of such as De Boer, O'Leary, Walter, Adamson, Gutas, and others in this regard are works that dedicate themselves to identifying the development of Hellenic philosophical elements and components at the hands and through the minds of those who receive them in the Islamicate world. This development may be judged as scant or, very much worthy of note, but in either case, it's a discussion on the development of a Hellenic style or Hellenic type philosophy. Such scholars, of course, do not deny, nor indeed underplay the influence of some essentially Islamic elements. They identify the place and role of ra'i and qiyas, give attention to the development of the religious schisms as affecting the developments of Islamic philosophy, and give due attention to the rise of the various schools of kalam, treating them either as precursors and facilitators to the reception of Hellenic philosophy, or as already themselves being clearly impacted and influenced by the Hellenic or the Greek thought. Nonetheless, most of them do not address either theology or mysticism as components of Islamic philosophy, though their treatment of these often ends up blurring the lines and somewhat fogging up the discussion. In general, if one is to give a simplified overview, probably going to regret this, but I said I will do this. Trying to give an oversimplified overview of the approach to the study of Islamic philosophy, with the emphasis on the term philosophy, and the purposes of the contrast with those who emphasize the term Islamic, I will permit myself the following snapshot. In general, right? Obviously, there's a lot more. Such an approach generally begins with an overview of the Islamic world in its early eras, with some attention to the rising political tensions and sectarian schisms, and onto a discussion of the rise of the various schools of kalam, which were already themselves affected, according to the scholars, by the Hellenic heritage as well as the Indo-Persian heritage. Thereon, invariably, in this kind of approach, follows a discussion of the translation movement. You already saw this, right? It begins with the translation movement, and an identification of the sources that were made available from the Greek and Roman heritage, which is then followed by a discussion of the development of what may indeed deserve being recognized as Islamic philosophy. From Al-Kindi in the east to Ibn Rushd in the west. The figures and philosophers usually covered are Al-Kindi, Abu Bakr al-Razi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, Al-Ghazali, the usual. Most of them close off with Ibn Rushd, though in more recent treatments we see they go further and include Miskawayh, Sahrawardi, Mulla Sadra. These works also would generally include a section on Islamic mysticism, therein also tracing the Hellenic and particularly Neoplatonic influences. In the last edition that Majid Fakhi wrote of his work on the history of Islamic philosophy, that was actually the main added part that he put in there, was a part on mysticism. And in recent works, they have also gone into include a discussion on the Illuminationist tradition with the works of Mulla Sadra. Now, on the other hand, for the author who approach and study the subject matter of Islamic philosophy with the emphasis being on the term Islamic, the approach is generally one that is rooted in precisely downplaying the reception of the Hellenic tradition, and emphasizing and bringing to light the propagation and development of philosophy out of the very spirit and essence of Islam. So it seems here we have a different species of philosophy being addressed and discussed. It is Islamic philosophy, born from the very spirit and essence of the Islamic worldview, rooted in the earliest discussions and debates at the time of the Prophet himself, and developed in the confines of Islamic concerns and traditions. As such, this is a philosophy that is Muslim in its essence, to borrow from Mian Sharif, seated in the words of the Quran, enjoined through the words of the prophetic and imamate traditions. Both Qurban and Nasr really focus on this, and carried on and developed as an Islamic philosophical endeavor through and through. Naturally, scholars who write on this Islamic, I don't know how to italize when speaking, so I'll just say Islamic philosophy, do not altogether reject the influence of the Hellenic elements, just as they do not deny the influence of Indo-Persian elements. However, they generally hold that these elements entered into play at a later stage, and only after what they are treating as Islamic philosophy had already developed and come to light as a system of thought and an all-encompassing worldview. So I'll attempt something similar again. So for the general approach that focuses on the term or puts the weight on the idea and aspect of Islamic philosophy, generally these works begin, particularly the more recent ones, with a repudiation of other scholarly works that either overemphasize the Hellenic or deny that there is such a thing as Islamic philosophy, or underplay or undermine it. They generally and from there they present arguments to emphasize the concept or the rootedness and authenticity of said philosophy, right? The argument of aṣāla. Invariably, these approaches will trace the development back to the very dawn of Islam, rooting themselves in clear Islamic premises from the revealed word in the Quran and the prophetic tradition. There then follows two general trends here. One in the authors I used, represented by the Abd al-Raziq approach, and the other by the Nasr Qurban approach. So the one best illustrated by Mustafa Abd al-Raziq, it brings to light the development of Islamic philosophy out of the nascent intellectual activity of the earliest Muslims at the time of the Prophet, and onwards through various discussions and developments in Islamic jurisprudence and theology. The other approach focuses more on the development of said philosophy following the schism, tracing it more essentially to the Shia tradition and thereon to the Persian Islamic development, almost always emphasizing how little of Arab elements there were. In this regard, the development of Islamic philosophy is highly connected to the development of the Imamate tradition in the early stages, and thereon to Ibn Sina and post-Avicennian traditions with the Ishraqi school of Suhrawardi and Mullah Sadra. The emphasis therein is not philosophy as an Arabized form of Greek philosophia, but rather on the elements and components of hikmah, understood as wisdom in its broadest sense. Even Abd al-Raziq references this. The prophetic element and the culmination of the contra-peripatetic philosophy with the illuminationist tradition and the Safavid Renaissance. Feedback, sorry. So in brief then, in a debate that on the surface appears to be one on mere naming, we come across differing approaches addressing two different subject matters. The authors and scholars emphasizing the Hellenic root of Islamic philosophy, and thereon moving to address it in its own development and transformation, are authors who are focused on the term philosophy. Whereas those who retort by emphasizing and highlighting the Islamic rootedness and authenticity of said philosophy seem to be in fact addressing something else, a different matter and form, so to speak. They are emphasizing Islamic philosophy, whose matter is Islamic, not Hellenic. But what about the very philosophers of the Islamicate themselves? What would they say they were engaged in and developing? Where would they and others of their contemporaries point to in terms of identifying the rootedness of their falāsifah? Now, the references to and statements on philosophy in the Islamicate world are, of course, numerous. And again, I'm going to, kind of confine myself to a few illustrations to show that for those engaged in it, consciously engaged in what they're calling falsafa, using that term, writing about it, or even criticizing it, the philosophy we have been conveniently labeling as Islamic philosophy was indeed for them a continuum and further development of the received Hellenic heritage, and not a product of the Islamic religious worldview and Islamic intellectual endeavors as such, from their perspective. In his work entitled Adab al-Falāsifah, the proprieties, I guess, of the philosophers, the 9th century translator and scholar Abu Zayd Hunayn ibn Ishaq puts forth a summation of the origins of the various philosophical schools, the manner in which they were named, whether after a teacher or a place, and some of the key sayings and anecdotes of the key figures. In identifying who the reference falāsifah speaks of, Ibn Ishaq writes that they are the savants of old and learned sages from whom philosophy and knowledge spring. Thereon, through the work, the reader will come across the following names and personages, each discussed singularly. There's many, so I won't go through the details. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Alexander, Luqman, the wise, Hermes, Homer, Solon, etc. My favorite, the jinn that addressed Sulaiman bin Dawood on an island. It's definitely my favorite. So of course it's interesting to know the presence of Homer there, Alexander, and as I said, the philosophers of the jinn. But more importantly for our purposes is the absence of any names associated with the Islamic religious traditions and sciences as such. Of course, these were very well known to Hunayn ibn Ishaq. He would have known to reference them if he would think of placing them within this development of falsafa. From this first illustration, we turn to a contemporary and colleague of Hunayn's, the figure most often taken to be the first of the series of Islamic philosophers. He actually received the epithet Falasuf al-Arab, right? The philosopher of the Arabs, right? Sultan al-Tarab, sorry, Falasuf al-Arab, which is, of course, Abu Yusuf Ishaq ibn Yaqub al-Kindi. Throughout his extant philosophical works, al-Kindi does not directly address the matter of the origination of philosophy as such, but it is nonetheless clearly taken to be the received Hellenic heritage and its subsequent development in the Islamic world. One would clearly encounter this as one reads through his philosophical works and noting the numerous references to Aristotle and Socrates. More direct trace of the rootedness of philosophy in which he is participating is set down in two instances in his works. The first is in the entry on his definitions, the book of definitions, Kitab Hudud al-Ashya wa Rusumiha, where he has an entry on what philosophy means. Of course, he gives many definitions for it. The first one, however, he says it's from its etymology, which is love of wisdom, because philosopher is composed of philo, lover, and sophia, wisdom. This is al-Kindi. And very clearly setting down the Greek origin. Of course, I know it's not a debate on the origin of the word, but another instant in his writings where he also sets down a definition of sorts, he explicitly works from Aristotle, writing, at the beginning of his Logic, Dialectica, Aristotle the philosopher said that philosophy, which is a knowledge about everything, is concerned in knowing what kind of knowledge it is and about what it is. So in light of that, it's clear that if we are to discuss al-Kindi and treat him in the context of Islamic philosophy, the emphasis would certainly be on the term philosophy, not on the term Islamic. This becomes explicitly clear as one goes on through his philosophical works, wherein all his arguments and discussions are basically rooted in what he believes and presents as the first principles of reason. In a similar vein, the encounter of philosophy with Al-Farabi is an encounter of philosophy in the Islamicate world rather than a purported Islamic philosophy. Throughout his works, as with other authors and figures, the distinction that Al-Farabi makes between philosophy and the Islamic and Arabic sciences is quite evident. In his work, Ihsa al-Ulum, the enumeration of the sciences, in which he covers the various linguistic, mathematical, philosophical, civil, and religious sciences and branches of science, the distinction is quite clear in the manner in which, for instance, he addresses logic, metaphysics, and divinity in a section separate from his discussion on fiqh and kalam and theology. Right? And as such, Abdul Razik, for instance, would not find grounds in Al-Farabi for treating Islamic philosophy as rooted in jurisprudence and theology. Additionally, the Greek grounding of philosophy is very explicit, as for instance in his treatment of the various subject matters and divisions of logic, where he most often references these back to the Greek root, and particularly to Aristotle's corpus. This rootedness in the Greek Hellenic tradition, and indeed the journey that philosophy takes from the Greeks to the Arab Islamic world, is actually addressed by Al-Farabi in another of his works, Zuhur al-falāsifah, or the rise of the philosophers. Now, unfortunately, that work is lost to us mostly, but we have a fragment of it preserved by the physician and historian Ibn Abi Usaybi'ah in the 12th century. And in his work intended as a history of medicine, عيون الأنباء في طبقات الأطباء. The account of the journey of philosophy as presented by Al-Farabi and preserved by Ibn Usaybi'ah, cited by Majid Fakhri, so traverses the following trajectory. According to Al-Farabi, philosophy first flourished during the reign of the Greek kings, the classical period. And thereon moved to Alexandria following the death of Aristotle, and flourished up to the death of Cleopatra. Thereafter, Al-Farabi references 12 teachers of philosophy that came on the scene during the Ptolemaic era, and thereon follows the trajectory of philosophy under the patronage of Augustus, the Roman emperor, and up to the rise of Christianity, where, quote, whereon instruction ceased in Rome but continued in Alexandria. Following that period, during which numerous of Aristotle's works were kept and studied, but others were dropped from such studies, namely his posterior analytics and topics, and with the coming of Islam, Al-Farabi reports that instruction moved from Alexandria to Antioch, where it lasted for a long time. A stage which was then followed by philosophy traversing to Harran and Merv, where it was carried by 2 students of the last teacher in Antioch. The one from Merv, Al-Farabi tells us, had 2 students who carried on the endeavor, whom he identifies as Ibrahim al-Marwazi and Yohanna ibn Haylan. And the one from Harran also had 2 students, whom Al-Farabi identifies as Israel al-Usquf and al-Quwayri. Thereon, bringing the trajectory all the way down to Al-Farabi himself, he tells us that the 2 students of the teacher from Merv are the ones that are credited with the continuing of the logical tradition in Baghdad, and whereby Ibrahim al-Marwazi became the teacher of Matta ibn Yunus, and while Yohanna ibn Haylan became Al-Farabi's teacher, with whom he studied logic up to and including the posterior analytics. This is according to Al-Farabi. But again, in brief, if you look at what Al-Farabi himself tells us is a trajectory of philosophy into his own hands, so to speak, it is really traversed from the classical Greek world down to Al-Farabi himself, and does not pass through any Islamic teachers or traditions or references, the likes of which Abdul Raziq, Korban, Nasser, more recently Roy Jackson would like to emphasize. Neither Al-Kindi nor Al-Farabi in their approach to the appropriation and study of philosophy are in any sense proponents of the authenticity of Islamic philosophy, but rather are more than explicit in its being a continuum of Greek philosophical heritage, as indeed is admitted and highlighted by the very central figures of the Illuminationist philosophy, namely Suhrawardi and Mulla Sadra, though with them it is then consciously taken in a different direction. Now, as a final note of illustration, we'll now move to the treatment of philosophy by the 9th century bibliographer Al-Nadim, who left us in his remarkable work, Al-Fihrist, a most illustrative list of various branches of the sciences of his time, their most famed figures and authors, and the works they wrote on the various subject matters and topics. His work includes sections dedicated to linguistics and grammar, poetry, religion, exegesis, theology, and philosophy. In the section dedicated to philosophy, which is distinct, again, and separate from the sections related to theology and jurisprudence, he first offers a general narrative related to the various figures on the origination of wisdom, hikmah, and the story of the 7 sages in ancient times. When he moves to speak of philosophy proper, I mean by the name falāsifah, he offers the following treatment that addresses both the question of the name and thereon the trajectory. On the name, An-Nadim writes of various accounts, one of which, for instance, is that Abu al-Khair ibn al-Khammar told me in the presence of Abu al-Qasim Isa ibn Ali, when I asked him who the first person was to speak about philosophy, that Porphyry of Thur of Tyre asserted in his book History, which is in Syriac, that the first of the 7 philosophers was Thales ibn Malis al-Amlisi. And I love how they Arabized that. This is Thales of Milesia. Right? So it's Thales ibn al-Amlisi, ibn Malis al-Amlisi. And on the second account, he says, others, of course, have said that it was Pythagoras. Plutarch said that Pythagoras was the first person to call philosophy by that name. Of course, the discussion on Islamic philosophy, I said, is not really, obviously it's not about whether this is an Arabic word. Of course, it's not an Arabic word. It's a Greek word. But I only offer these brief excerpts from Al-Nadim and Al-Kindi before him to emphasize that when Nadim and his contemporaries were writing on philosophy, that is the philosophy that they had in mind. The one that originated with Thales al-Amlisi on one account, or with Pythagoras on the other. And as such, when Nadim later in the same chapter moves to speak about Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi, although Al-Farabi briefly, he's speaking of them as philosophers in that sense, and not as Islamic philosophers. Having presented the various accounts on the origin of the name, and Nadim then offers us a list of key figures. I'll go briefly over it. Again, it includes the usual suspects, right? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Porphyry, etc., all the way down to Aristotle and Theon, the commentators, and then the chapter, an account of Al-Kindi. In light of that, if nothing else, we find that it would be rather amiss to speak of an Islamic philosophy in the sense that Abd al-Razak Qurban et al. Are trying to speak. It is certainly undeniable that philosophy was present in the classical Islamic world, as attested to by these brief illustrations, but it was a philosophy that was explicitly, by its own practitioners, not me, seen as rooted in the Greek philosophical heritage, not one that was developed and brought about or brought to light out of the Islamic religion and worldview. Even its critics, in addressing it, were clearly not thinking of Islamic philosophy. And very briefly, I'll just mention, of course, Al-Ghazali. When you read Al-Ghazali's The Incoherence of the Philosophers, or when you read Al-Ghazali's Rescuer from Error, particularly the Rescuer from Error, let's take that as an illustration. He has a section on the Mutakallimun, a section on the philosophers, section on the Batinites, section on the Sufis. The philosophers are not connected to the Batinites, not connected to the Mutakallimun. In the Batinites section, by the way, he mentions Ikhwan al-Safa. Right? He places them there. In the section on the philosophers, the ones he names explicitly, of the Greeks are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and of the Islamic philosophers, it's Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. Right? So even their own critics were not looking at them as some bid'ah developed out of a misreading of Islamic tradition or Islamic teachings, right? But we're actually attacking them precisely on their Hellenizing and Hellenized philosophy. So to sum up, with a view to capturing, albeit very briefly here, the key aspects of this philosophy in the Islamicate world, we can say that from its early formative stages, it grew out of a synthesis of worldviews and philosophies, but not out of a distinctly Islamic one towards a uniquely Islamic philosophy. The philosophers of the Islamicate world worked with, and indeed they revered, Aristotle, but an Aristotle that had come down to them over centuries of commentary, translation, and interpretation. It wasn't Aristotle, it was at least 1,000 years. They also, and to varying degrees, worked with the words of Socrates and the works of Plato as well as Plotinus, though often they would read Plotinus under the false impression that they were reading Aristotle, which is a very happy accident, by the way. In addition, these philosophers of the Islamicate world could not be expected to shake off entirely the Indo-Persian sediments that colored their milieu and worldview. And these too found their way into the philosophical output. Philosophy in the Islamicate world has developed as a synthesis of all these various sources, brought together in a truly transformative manner that managed to wed and weave the various elements to the others in this mosaic. When the student of these works looks closely, they can definitely identify the various pieces of the mosaic and their sources. But the final product, so to speak, the complete picture, is not any of its individual pieces, nor does it resemble any of them alone. It would seem, however, that most studies of the field have been overly interested in the pieces that they may have overlooked the whole, just as one who cannot see the forest for the trees. In conclusion, I will allow myself the following humble suggestion or proposal. With the aim of addressing the debate on the name, along with the intended essence of the named, and with a view to distancing this philosophy or field of philosophy from both the claims of its Islamic rootedness on the one hand, and the claims of its being little more than Greek philosophy in Arabic on the other hand, perhaps we could name this rose Islamicate philosophy. I think in this manner, we can move forward with less ambiguity and perhaps greater determination to seek out the essence and development of this different rose by a different name. Thank you.
Thank you for this crystal clear lecture. It's very loud. Okay. Thank you, Hani.
crystal clear.
Yeah, it was very crystal clear, the lecture.
Thank you.
Very organized, very well structured. It reminds me of a debate also in my field of what is actually Islamic about Islamic literature.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And we end up with Abu Nuwas being Islamic literature because there's a lot of Quran in it, especially in his mujun. But what is Islamic about Islamic science as well? And Islamicate, of course, solves the problem. But then we come to explain Islamicate to other, to people outside our field. It's a very funny, name, but many people are using it now, like including Sabina Schmidtke and many others. There's a journal actually now, and the book series, Islamicate World. I just find it no difference between Islamicate and Islam. It starts from there.
That's where it starts.
That's where it starts.
Yeah, the
right?
70s, I think.
And I remember, I studied for many years under Dimitri Gutas, who, by the way, accepted to come to AUB in the fall. And I would like to invite you to conduct a conversation with him in the fall.
Great.
What bothered him the most, right, is the ethnic part in the discussion. In his book, Greek Thought, Arabic Culture, where people understand Greek as the ethnicity and Arabic as Arab, right?
Absolutely.
Because these people were not Greek, it's Hellenistic.
Absolutely.
Most of them do not come from, from Greece, and they actually come from Lebanon and other places. And of course, when we talk about Arabic, we don't mean Arab, right?
Absolutely.
We cannot know whether Ibn Sina, for example, was Arab, a Turk, or Persian or something else for that matter. It's impossible. I remember to Gutas, what's important is the language, right? Because it's something we can see and we can read and etc.
تمام.
فاللغة هي العربية حتى تعيد تشكيل الفكر. ولذلك وجهة نظر غوتاس الفكر هو اللغة واللغة هي الفكر. ولذلك اعتبر اللغة العربية هي التي صنعت أو أعادت صنع المسائل الفلسفية.
In any case, I open now the floor for discussion.
والفكر والثقافة العربية.
Dr. Rudwan. We have a question from Kirsten and George.
I remember that when you mentioned Fakhri's angle on the philosophy, there's this new chapter of mysticism.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what did he mean there? Ruhaniyat, spiritual stuff, or what? And then would Islamicate how would they deal with what he called mysticism?
Sure. Is this tonight? Sorry. Thanks, Bilal. Thank you for that. So the last edition he added that, kind of going into addressing mysticism, and also, by the way, the Ishraqi school as well, where he didn't conclude them in previous editions. But even as he does so cautiously, because the mysticism here, not in the ruhaniyat sense, but actually in the turuq, in the Sufi schools, the Sufi turuq, right? And the early zuhud. And so how can one look at the development from the early ascetic traditions into the development of Sufism within the Islamicate world, and its connection to the development of the philosophical worldview. And there are already those who would argue that already there you have the Neoplatonic influence, right? I mean, it's already there. So one could already say, well, it's developed again out of a Hellenic heritage, although of course it goes on a totally different direction. But of course, when we say that, whether we say that about the Sufi school, Turuq, or about the philosophers, to say that it begins with the Hellenic reception of Hellenic works or heritage, of course doesn't deny that it also works with its current milieu, obviously. And for me, that's really what should be our focus, that synthesis. And I think you will find an amazing synthesis when you look at the way that the mystical turuq developed, or the philosophical schools, or the scientific, or even the schools of kalam and etc. It's not either or for them. And I want to connect this back to what Bilal was saying. They didn't have these issues that we seem to have. It's really odd. Like, it's falāsifah. شو عربية Islam? It's falāsifah. I mean, it doesn't have but unfortunately, and this is why I do appreciate Sayyid Hussein Nasr's kind of treatment, not that I agree with it, I appreciate it, in that he says the focus on naming it Arabic philosophy seems to be connected to a political agenda, right? Because in the 19th century, and let's keep that in mind, the background, that in the 19th century, you think of, great names, Ernest Renan, Hegel, and even I found this even in Bertrand Russell early in the 20th century. They deny any possibility of the development of philosophy in the Islamic world. I mean, whether on, Renan, it's very clear. He's like, that's a mind incapable of philosophical development. Right, I mean, he says it explicitly. Hegel kind of plays around on that. Hegel in his lectures on the history of philosophy, he credits the Mohammedans, as he calls them, that they kept this torch alight and passed it to the Latin West. And, bravo, thank you. Right, that's it. And so a lot of what comes in the 20th century, already with Abdul Razak and many others, is of course a reaction to this. Is of course saying that, it's part of this kind of response to the undermining of the development of intellectual history in our part of the world, which may have gone awry when it starts to connect itself maybe to a political agenda of saying Arabic, not in the language sense, unfortunately, right? And I think this is the key. It is Arabic language. It is Greek language also. Aristotle is Macedonian. Menno ibn Athena. And of course, periphery, Mansur. But the language was Greek, and the heritage was Hellenic. And so in the same way we could speak of, the Arabic philosophy. I agree with you that Islamicate is a bit, if you know the Druids, it's a bit Druidy, like only those who know it, right? I agree on that. But my fear is Arabic already has become a loaded word. Yeah. Islamic has become a loaded word. And it's clear, it's there. Including, the early mysticism in terms of saying, is this Islamic mysticism as opposed to what? I read some of the Islamic mystics and then I read Christian mystics, and there's a lot more in common there than with the mutakallimun of their time. So, yeah. And that's, all the way circle back, thank you. And that's the manner in which Majid Fakhri wants to treat it. Try to place it kind of around the philosophical development, but not in the middle of it, definitely.
There was a question from Joe.
Yes, please.
Both of them? Hani, thanks a lot, Hani. First, I want to tell you that by using this name, Islamicate, you allow me to deal with somebody like Abu Bakr Razi. I mean, he was not an Arab,
absolutely.
And he definitely was an atheist if you know anything about him. So you can put him here, but you cannot put him in any of the other two. The other question I have for you is that all this debate could stem from which part of Aristotle you are focusing on, because the big debate between the mutakallimun and the philosophers is the eternity of the word. Whereas in Christianity, you could be a scholasticist and a philosopher at the same time, like Thomas of Aquin. He was both a mutakallim and a philosoph. But in Islam, because they had this problem with the eternity of the word, they had this very big divide between them. And I would like to have your opinion about that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for both really important points. And I will start with the Abu Bakr Razi reference, because when I teach the course, I always include him. And it's difficult to explain how I include him, right? Because it's Abu Bakr Razi, right? But of course, he's a key figure. Although, of course, most of his works were unfortunately destroyed. But what I love about this character, and thank you for mentioning him, he has a work that survives, As-Sira al-Falsafiyya, which is basically a whole work proving that he's a philosopher. I mean, he was accused of being a heretic, right, to put it mildly. We don't have a work that survives where he's proving that he's not. But apparently someone told him, you're not a real philosopher. سكرت معه. Right? And he writes السيرة الفلسفية. And he says, how dare you not call me or allow me to be counted amongst the philosophers. Right? And he gives his whole argument for how he is a philosopher. So, but as you said, if I'm looking at Arabic philosophy, he fits very well. My problem personally, when I look at it as Arabic philosophy, what do I do with خمياء السعادة of Al-Ghazali, which he purposely wrote in Persian, because he wanted a different readership there. But no, I mean, it's, if anything, for me, this is the most philosophical Al-Ghazali gets without getting out of the closet, because I count him as a closet philosopher. Right? And Griffith, of course, does, Frank Griffith. So on to the other point, I think the idea that you cannot be a mutakallim and a philosopher in that sense is correct when you look at the post-Mu'tazila era. Right? With the Mu'tazila, no, I mean, it was fine. As far as we know, because again, all the references to the Mu'tazila we have are not the actual Mu'tazilites themselves, but their opponents. But I take one figure which says, no, you can be all of that, which is Ibn Rushd. Right? Ibn Rushd was chief judge of Cordoba, right? Qadi Qudat. He was a very well-known scholar of kalam and fiqh. And of course, he was a physician, court physician, and he was a philosopher. And when you read his works, it's so clear who his audience is. When you read, the one most referenced, Kitab Fasl al-Maqal, that's not one of his philosophy works. That's actually a work written for non-philosophers, right? It's rooted in theology. The first page is an argument from theology, absolutely. I think the issue of the eternality of the world was, of course, addressed, but it wasn't necessarily accepted as a fait accompli. I mean, Al-Kindi, for instance, argued against it, using Aristotle in Kitab Al-Kindi Falsafa Al-Ula, on first philosophy. He actually makes a whole argument against the eternality of the world, right? But purely philosophical. He doesn't bring in not a single theological reference, not a single verse. But his argument is that if you use the tools of reason, you cannot have an eternal world, or an infinite and then eternal. And then, therefore, it must have a cause outside of itself, right? Something like Aquinas later presents. For the other philosophers, particularly if you think of Al-Farabi, it's not really eternality, but it's neither creation. I mean, it just is. And again, that won't sit well with Kalam after the Mu'tazila. I think with the Mu'tazila, one could agree to disagree, I think. But you're right, that was an issue. Of course, the other issue was, of course, the issue of divine justice. That was a serious issue, of course, as well. This idea that whatever God does is just doesn't sit well with the rational kind of, not even Al-Kindi, by the way. So, thank you.
Thank you. If we want to think about philosophy, the Islamicate philosophy or philosophy in the Islam world, one may think of it as the influence of Islam on philosophy. Generally, philosophy, as you said, is philosophy. And then came Islam, and there was an influence. And maybe the Islamic philosophers were restrained by the Quran verses. Because if we take the Quran, Muslims believe that there is everything in it, and there is an explanation of everything. And people who are strict about it probably wouldn't allow much for philosophy. My question would be, just before Islam, in the Arab world, are there Arab philosophers before Islam, please, and what is their contribution?
No. Thank you. A very good question. Allow me to start with the first part, and then I'll move to this. Actually, I can start with the second part. No, that's a simple answer. Not in the sense that there is no philosophical thinking, right? And I think that's the key distinction to make, because philosophy, as we now are referencing it today, as our scholars have been referencing it, does require the translation movement. That's a given. I don't think anyone wants to deny that. The very term falsafa is an Arabized form of philosophia. So to say that whereas there philosophers before that, well, not before the word was available, let's put it that way. Was there philosophical thinking? Was there rational thinking? I would imagine it would be weird to say no, because nothing comes out of a vacuum, right? Even if you put philosophy aside, the debates that happened at the dawn of the Islamic revelation are rational debates at the end of the day. Did it develop into a system? No. My sense is, no, you will need at least the 2nd century Hijri to see a development of a complete system, which then gets into what we are now referencing as philosophy. So yeah, agreed. But again, that's also related to the development of writing in prose as opposed to verse. That also takes time, right? It's difficult. It's not impossible, but it's difficult to make a philosophical argument in verse. It would be interesting. What's his name? Lucretius does it, of course, the Roman. To the other point, and it's a point that, for instance, Musaf Abdel Razak makes, that Henri Corbin to some extent, that you needed philosophy in order for that to come up, right? I could say you needed Greek mythology for philosophy to come up. I mean, that's not particular to Islam, right? Because what is Greek mythology trying to do? It's trying to understand the world. What is Roman mythology trying to do?
All mythologies.
Right? All mythologies. And then all monotheistic Abrahamic traditions, they're doing the same. So to expect a system, and I know that's not what you said, sorry, but to expect a system to develop independent of its first order worldview, then no, of course not. Of course it's going to come out of it. The question, did they use the tools of philosophy, of the Islamic? And I'll just try to keep it brief and just say Al-Farabi Book of Letters, definitely not. If you look at Al-Farabi's Book of Letters, in fact, he would argue the opposite. His argument there is very clearly that philosophical development must occur before the appearance of a religion, right? Necessarily. And the relation he puts between them, interestingly, he says it's like the relation of the tool to the tool user. And the tool must appear first. So philosophy must appear first. The tool user is then religion. Because in Al-Farabi's mindset, explicitly, right, he's not trying to go also their constraint. Not all of them. Some of them were quite outspoken. Al-Farabi being one of them. He says very explicitly in Kitab al-Huruf that, I'm paraphrasing, woe to a nation if they receive religion, they haven't gotten philosophy yet. Because then their understanding of their religion will be flawed. Right? So that's one way to look at it. Because for Al-Farabi, religion, or the revealed word, allow me to say rather, offers to the masses in a common language the truths of philosophy. So I need the truths first. That's one way. But yes, I agree with others. They might, even Ibn Sina, by the way, he can be that outspoken in some points. I mean, he places what he calls holy intellect, al-aql al-Qudsi, he places it on the same level as acquired intellect of the philosopher. They're on the same level. He says the only distinction is the time it takes to get there. Yep. Thank you. Do we have it? Yeah. Didn't you have a question as well?
Okay, thank you very much, Hani. My question is, it might seem simplistic, but why can't we just avoid the naming issue and just focus on the timing issue?
On the?
Timing
Yeah.
issue. Why is it?
Because we have another issue there, right?
I mean, as an age, or branching issue.
Right.
I mean, philosophy has so many branches, and I'm sure. I mean, we can discuss Arabic/Islamic in terms of branches. Why is this exclusive to Western philosophy and not to our part of the world philosophy? Is that also just some kind of pigeonholing the kind of intellectual activity that takes place in this part of the world? Thank you.
Thank you. A very important question. And it's not pigeonholing as much as categorization and reaction, right? Because, and to my mind, like I actually, kind of always think, why is it only here that we find this problem? Like somebody says, Scottish Enlightenment philosophy, okay, right? Scholastic philosophy, all right. Jewish philosophy, all right. Chinese philosophy, all right. Islamic philosophy, Is there such a thing? Right? And that's part of the whole debate, particularly in the mid-20th century. And I say mid-20s because that's when they rediscovered the works of Al-Kindi. They had thought they were mostly gone. The reaction against, wallah, we do have a philosophy, right? And you have this heritage from the 19th century, particularly into the early 20th century, that's saying no, you don't. It's Greek philosophy and Arabic. So I think it's both sides that are pushing for the naming debate. I think if you go to the age issue, there's another. I don't know if you noticed. I referenced the classical Islamic age, right, or classical Islam. Others would say medieval Islamic philosophy. I don't consider it medieval or pre-modern.
Because all these terms
right?
are also problematic.
Absolutely, right? Many discuss this in terms of pre-modern or medieval. No, it's not medieval. It's medieval in the European timeline. In the Islamic timeline, it's classical.
Yeah.
Right? I wish we didn't have all, but unfortunately, it's there. Bilal, please, yeah.
لا أكيد يعني of course what is also Islamic about Islamic art, right? The questions will always be there, but this is the problem with language, right? We need terms, and terms are categories, and we use a certain term for a certain period of time, and then until someone criticizes it, and then we have to change. It's the nature of academia, I guess.
Sorry, yes. Historically, by the way, if you go to the 16th century, I would say, when interest first really began in England, particularly with the translation of Ibn Tufail's work, they translated Philosophus Autodictatus. Trying to remember the son and father name. There was the establishment of the Arabic chair, or the chair for Arab studies, and then they did the same in France, and that's what the reference that someone like Kantian and Nasser don't like, that this is a heritage of the medievalists labeling us. Right? And no, this is Islamic. But then that creates another problem. And I think it would be great if we could find a way to branch, not in the sense of time or even Islamicate or reference, but you actually have the naturalist philosophers of that epoch, and then you have the kind of more metaphysics.
Yeah, exactly. Why can't we have this kind of discussion?
Well, we can.
Content and not placement or...
I think we can, and it's being had, right? Emma, right? Sorry. It's becoming more.
Personally, I hold this.
Yeah.
There is an ambiguity which should be lifted here. Islamic, when it has been used, Islamic is not Muslim.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is very important.
Absolutely.
So when scholars decided to use Islamic, it was precisely as a cultural attribute to, as you said before, include philosophy written in Persian.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is why, also, as you said, some people resorted ultimately to use Arabic and Islamic philosophy.
Yeah.
This would be the more classic. But I agree with
Nisreen.
is that personally on my studies I use Orwell's philosophy in classical Islam because to precisely put the emphasis on philosophy. Now to go back to this issue of so nobody would deny, I think, besides the two people you mentioned, that that philosophy is rooted in Hellenic philosophy, but also we should not reduce it to that. And that's
Agreed.
important because even the translation movement started and was triggered by precisely Kalam issues, meaning one of the first books of Aristotle which was translated was the Topics.
Absolutely.
They needed arguments against the Christians and so on and so forth. So there is it. So I would say things are much more ambiguous.
Right.
And we should not deny this philosophy was not translated in a void. It was translated in a Muslim environment, responding to Muslim problems also. And this is important to highlight without at all reducing it to Muslim.
Islamic or Muslim.
So Islamic is considered, has been always considered as a cultural and geographical, let's say cultural area. So that would be my 2 cents.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, but thank you so much, Emma, for that. That was, I would say, my initial also approach to anyone who uses the term Islamic, particularly when you're talking about, Rosenthal and all others. My my issue started particularly with Korba, and then Nasser, and then more recently Roy Jackson. So we have this school, but you're absolutely right in saying, of course you don't want to reduce it. It would be weird to reduce it to the translation movement or the Hellenic heritage. Now, of course, there's something far more going on here.
But also, there is something you can bring into the picture, which was a debate within the Islamic society. It's the debate with foreign sciences.
Right. And ancient sciences.
Yeah, so foreign, meaning the Greek science.
Right.
And you know very well the controversy, for example, the emblematic between Siraki
Yep.
and Bishop Metta. This was the tension at the time, but like we have culture and it's very important. And this tension pervades science and philosophy and was overcome at some point. Ibn Rushd, the Fasl Maqal is the fatwa, is not even theology.
أعلى صح لأنه بيوصل على conclusion شرعية. Yes.
And really explaining with
صح.
juridical argument why
تحكم شرع بيوصل.
So maybe can we say the contribution of Islam to philosophy? The contribution of Islam to philosophy, especially that I've heard or read something that after the fall down of the Andalus, the Arabic Andalus, then culture went into Europe and philosophy flourished in Europe after the contribution of Ibn Rushd as well, among others maybe.
يا جماعة ما هناك شغلات صارت الآن معروف من أيام فيتجنشتاين وهايدجر ما حدا بيحكي عن شيء إلا باللغة لذلك في ناس بيقولوا اللغة العربية باعتبار الفلسفة بس هي حضارة إسلامية كبرى وفيها عدة تيارات وهذه التيارات منها تيار يميل للتفكير العقلي ومنها التيار مصطفى عبد الرازق يقول لا أنا أبحث عن الأصالة ويحكي النص فلسفتنا عن اليونان التانيين يحكي الصوفية عن النور أحسن ناس اللي يعملوا تخصص فلسفة القانون يسموه أول ما أخذوا عن حد
that was homegrown صحيح تمام صحيح
بيجوا بعد منهم المتكلمين وبيجوا بعد منهم الصوفية آخر شيء فلسفة الإسلام من حيث الأصالة يعني تهديد ثلاث سنوات مش صحيح لولا الإسلام واللغة العربية شو هذا ابن سينا بيعمل 50 حيلة حتى يضل مسلم
تمام. We have one more Haram, she's been waiting. Please.
صار عندي شغف انه ارجع للكشف عن مناهج الادله لابن رشد وكمان كيف استوعبوه الاوروبيين كدبل تروث انه اللي اخذوا عن فهموه كدبل
طبعا false reading.
هيدي القصه يعني ذكرتني بالهيدي الاسلاميك ولا اسلاميك بانه دبل تروث ولا وان تروث يعني فلسفه از كرايتيريا فور
صح صحيح.
يعني كل شيء philosophy of religion philosophy of science اليوم عم نحكي بالاي اي بالارتفيشال انتليجنس شو الفلسفه اللي عم التكنولوجي مع المعرفه حيكون محض بدون الانسانيات ونحن عم نقول انه دمج المعارف كلياتها ببعض.
صح. No, thank you, بالعكس, thank you. And it was one truth. There's only one. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hani.
يعطيك العافية. Thank you so much, Bilal. Thank you.
It's very engaging.